fortunate today to have a speaker who's going to talk about a topic that's really quite current these days. You're hearing a lot of people talking about monarch butterflies. John Pleasance is an adjunct professor for the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology. He's been at Iowa State since '79, I believe. Got his degree from UCLA a couple years before that. He's interested in a wide variety of topics, pollinators, compass plants, gene flow, and excuse me, between GMO cotton and native cotton and milkweed reproduction and a lot of other botanical items that are of current interest today. So, John Pleasance, why monarch butterfly population decline and what we can do about it.
Thanks, Daryl, and thank you all for coming. So let's see, we need to.
I'll cut these lights.
The lights there we go. So so we're going to be talking about the monarch butterfly, which some people have called an iconic insect, and I think rightly so. If you asked somebody on the street to name a butterfly, they'll mostly will tell you monarch butterfly. So it's something that's very well known. It's the state insect of 7 states, and it's also sort of come to be the symbol of lots of things. So this is the label if there's a food product that's certified non-GMO. There's their representation of a monarch butterfly, and there's an ad that's been running recently. Let's see if I can get this to come up. Let's see if there's we go. You won't hear the. Oh, okay. I guess maybe I'm not hooked up here. All right, let's skip that. If you've seen an ad on TV recently for some financial company that used to be called ING and now it's Voya, you'll see a little sort of monarch-looking butterfly come out of a chrysalis and join with a whole bunch of other ones to form the word Voya. So it's just used for a lot of things. I think one of the things that intrigues people about monarch butterflies is the fact that it migrates to Mexico. All the ones that are in at least the eastern part of the population all migrate. They did this sometime in September. And they go down to Mexico, to one little spot in these mountains west of Mexico City, where they cluster on branches of this special fir tree in the hundreds of thousands of millions. And one of the things that's interesting is that for a long time we didn't even know where these things went in Mexico. So figuring that out really involved tagging a lot of butterflies. How many people here have tagged a butterfly? There we go. So how many people have seen this movie, The Flight of the Butterfly? Okay. We'll have to get that. It doesn't seem to have gotten a lot of play. But so there was this guy, Fred Urquhart. There he is. Looks a little like Daryl, don't you think? So this guy, he lived in Toronto and was intrigued with monarch butterflies, and he was really one of the first people to start tagging monarchs. He noticed that in the fall they kind of all start moving en masse someplace to the south, and so he started tagging these things and getting people to pick up the tags and tell them, well, where these things were, where did you find these things, and basically what he was finding was that he would get records, people calling in from, Iowa and Oklahoma and Texas, and then they left Texas, and he had no idea where they went. And it wasn't until 1976 that somebody actually found this location in Mexico where these things were overwintering. And this is actually Fred Urquhart. This is his first trip to the overwintering site in Mexico, and he's actually looking at a butterfly that has one of his tags on it. So, you can imagine, as a scientist, 38 years. This is 38 years after starting this tagging program. So you can imagine, as a scientist, suddenly, you find the answer to this thing that you've been looking for all this time. So one can imagine the emotions he was going through. So the monarch migrates to Mexico, and this is actually fairly convenient for figuring out what the size of the population is. For a lot of insects, it's difficult to figure out what the size of the population is because they're scattered all over the place, and you have to sample here and have to sample there. Here, they all go to one place, and they can be counted. Now, you can't count them one by one. They're just, if you saw the pictures of the clusters, that's just too many of them. But what they do is they count the hectares, which is 2.47 acres, the hectares of area covered by these overwintering monarchs. And so this was started in earnest in the 1994-95 season, and it's continuing to today. And every year, people who are interested in monarchs wait sometime January or February, the number comes out. How's the population doing this year? Well, the numbers we've been getting lately have not been good. And I think you can visualize sort of a general downward trend in all of this. And statistically, that's the case too. In fact, the last 4 years, it's just been going steadily down till last year, we had the lowest ever recorded. And just to give you some perspective on this, so compared to this year and that year, estimates are this is about 20.97 hectares. That is the equivalent of about a billion plus individual monarchs. So we went from that down to this. This is about maybe 40 million. Now that seems like a lot, but I'll show you somewhere along the line here about what can happen on the overwintering population. So just a few things about monarch biology to make sure we're all on the same page. Which one is the male? Okay, the one that has, I think I've got, there we go. Whoop. So these two little black dots tell you that that's a male. There's some other characteristics too. We know that they feed exclusively on members of the plant family, Asclepias, the milkweeds. We've seen milkweeds. Many of you have seen a scene like this, cornfield with a roadside or something next to it with flowering milkweeds. And females will find a patch of milkweeds or individual milkweeds, and she'll snake her abdomen underneath and oviposit an egg. So it looks like close up, kind of a neat looking thing. And then the egg, if it hatches successfully, the larvae go through a series of 5 instars until they get big enough to make a chrysalis, and then the monarch adult emerges. So let's take a look at the whole life cycle of the population as opposed to just the species individuals itself. So, and in particular, well, let's go through the life cycle first, and then we'll talk about points of vulnerability. So if we're trying to figure out, why the population is declining, there are various points during this whole population life cycle that we can focus on. So we talked about them going down to Mexico to overwinter. Here's the location. So in the spring, this would be around February or so, they will move out of the overwintering grounds and come up here, mostly into Texas, where they will breed. So that's the first generation out of Mexico. Then sometime around mid to late May, the offspring from that generation will start moving up here into there's Iowa, into our area and up into the eastern part of the U.S. And that's the summer breeding ground. And they'll be there for probably at least 2 generations. Sometimes maybe they can have a 3rd generation. And so the offspring from the last generation up here in the summer breeding ground will then migrate back south to Mexico. And again, one of the intriguing things about the species is that those butterflies that are migrating to Mexico have never been to Mexico before. Neither have their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. So they're somehow programmed to go there. Exactly how they get there, how they know, when they've arrived, why this one little spot in Mexico is so special, is one of the enduring mysteries of monarch butterflies. So when we think about why the population has declined, there are a bunch of things we can look at. One, of course, is here they are in Mexico. They've sort of put all their eggs in one basket. They're all right in one place. So bad things, if they happen there, could really impact the population. So and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So that's one point of vulnerability. Then in February, they've got to get out of Mexico. They've got to come up to Texas to breed. They're passing over really a lot of desert area. They're already pretty depleted. They don't feed on anything when they're in Mexico. They have to have their lipid reserves get them all the way through. And so they're coming out of a cool area where their metabolic rate is pretty low. Now they have to get very active, fly up here to Texas, hope to find maybe some nectar along the way to keep them going. So getting there is a problem. Then they're in Texas, and we have to have a breeding generation. Texas has had recurrent droughts for a number of years now. That could be an issue. Then they've got to get up here into the summer breeding range, and then what I'm going to focus on is what's going to happen up in here and how that can affect the population as a whole. And then, of course, they have to get back here, which means they have to also fly back, get enough nectar reserves so that their lipid stores are sufficient for them to get through the winter. So lots of points of vulnerability and lots of things we could focus on to try to figure out why the population is declining. What I'm going to focus on is primarily the summer habitat and what things are going on there, why that might give us a clue as to what's going on. And the summer breeding area, the real main meat of the summer breeding area is this shaded area right in here. So back in the mid-1990s, some people went to Mexico. They looked at the butterflies there. They used some stable isotope analysis to tell where the ones that were here in Mexico had come from. Where did they live as larvae? And it turns out most of them came from this area up in here, which should look kind of familiar to you. That's kind of where a lot of corn is planted and where a lot of soybeans are planted. So it's likely that agricultural things can have some influence on monarch butterflies. And the first time this came up as an issue had to do with BT corn. So in 1999, a researcher at Cornell wondered whether BT corn pollen could be harmful to monarchs. So BT corn has a gene inserted into the corn plant specifically to kill lepidopterans, butterflies, and moths, and in particular the European corn borer. That's the target species. But a BT corn plant the pollen that it makes, that pollen will also have this BT toxin in it. And so this person wondered whether, if you had a milkweed leaf that had BT corn pollen on it and a monarch larva was eating it, could that be harmful? And so he did some lab work just feeding monarch larvae milkweed leaves with BT corn pollen, and they didn't do very well. So the specter was raised of BT corn pollen killing monarchs. So this was about the time when BT corn was beginning to take off. So if you follow this purple line here, here's 1999. It was about maybe almost 30% of all corn was BT corn. Since then, it's up to about 76% today. So BT corn was just kind of coming on the scene, and so this specter was raised of BT corn pollen being damaging to monarchs. And so myself and a number of other people at a variety of universities kind of came together to look into this question to see if this was really something that was of some concern. And one of the things we found, and any farmer could have told us this, is, you know, if you go out in cornfields, you're going to see some milkweeds out there. Here's some more. And in fact, here's a cornfield with, there's a couple of caterpillars feeding on a milkweed plant in the field. And of course, they're also in soybean fields too. And so we started a project to look at this whole BT corn issue. It involved going out into fields, seeing how much milkweed was out there, how much pollen from corn plants was on the milkweed, and so on. And there were some very interesting things that we found. One of them was that, yes, we did find monarchs out in these cornfields. Before we did this, people thought, well, okay, maybe there's milkweeds out there, but, you know, monarchs can't find it, you know, in the canopy, in the corn canopy. It's not likely for them to get out there. But in fact, what we found, if you look at the eggs per milkweed stem, there were actually more monarch larvae per milkweed stem, or monarch eggs per milkweed stem, in the corn and soybean fields than out in roadsides and other areas. So that was something that people hadn't realized. So we put together all the information we had on this particular subject and published a series of papers in PNAS. The original paper, sort of raising a red flag or potential red flag for BT corn pollen and monarchs, got a lot of press, and we were hoping to have this paper, or the series of papers, come out and sort of lay the issue to rest, because you'll see that it turns out to be a non-issue. And we were all set to go to Washington, D.C. and have a press conference about this, and then 9/11 happened. So we didn't do that, and for a lot of people, the bell has been rung and never unrung. But what we did find was that BT corn really has a very negligible effect on the monarch population. There's a very limited time in a cornfield when pollen is being shed. The monarch population at that time is pretty small, and the amount of pollen that you would find on milkweed leaves is low enough that it's below the threshold that would produce any harmful effects. So BT corn is not harming monarch butterflies. But we did find some things that were very unknown and fairly astounding. The one that I mentioned was that it seemed like monarchs were using the milkweeds in agricultural fields much more heavily than they were milkweeds elsewhere. And then knowing that, and knowing something about the densities of milkweeds in agricultural fields, we realized that maybe 80% or more of the monarch population that was going off down to Mexico had actually come from agricultural fields. They were breeding in the agricultural fields. So that was a realization that was kind of sobering. And that brings us to the second GMO. So BT corn is a GMO, genetically modified organism. The second one is the so-called Roundup Ready crops, Roundup Ready soybeans, Roundup Ready corn. And this is called HT, or herbicide tolerant. Here's Roundup Ready corn, just starting to take off here in around 2000 when we were starting this work. And Roundup Ready soybeans had already become pretty popular. Over 50% of all soybeans were Roundup Ready. And so we were working in these fields about the time when things were transitioning from sort of conventional herbicides to all the Roundup Ready crops. And so my colleagues basically had sort of finished the Bt corn issue and gone off to other things, but I was still out in these fields looking at these little clusters of milkweeds year after year after year. And there were some things that I was noticing. One is that when conventional herbicides were used, you would see something like this. So these are the milkweed plants out here. The leaves would turn brown and the leaves would fall off, but new leaves would sprout back. The plants had not been killed. And in fact, sometimes these things really leafed out to the extent that they even flowered at some later point in time. So it didn't seem like the conventional herbicides are really doing much harm to the monarchs. But it was a very different story for the Roundup Ready crop. So here's a different soybean field. This has just been sprayed a couple days ago with glyphosate, which is what Roundup is. And you can see this is a pretty heavily infested field with weeds, and there's also some milkweed plants in there looking pretty healthy right now. Here's 8 days later, and here's the milkweeds here looking kind of punk. Here's a little close-up of that. By 18 days later, basically most of the milkweeds are in fact dead. There's no resprouting when you have glyphosate. And so this just shows you this in a graphical form. So here's a patch of milkweeds in a field. If glyphosate is sprayed, if conventional herbicide is sprayed, they suffer a little bit, but then they come back. If you have glyphosate sprayed, they just the little patch goes to almost nothing. So and what I was seeing over this period of time was Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready soybeans really picking up. I mean, today about 85% of corn is Roundup Ready, about 93% of soybeans. And the amount of glyphosate being used, this is just use in 2011, you can see is very, very heavy. And over the years since the mid-90s to the present, the total use of glyphosate has increased enormously. If you look at this is just for Iowa. If you look at Iowa and look for places where milkweeds could be, one is CRP land, that's land set aside from farming, pastures and grasslands, roadsides and farmsteads, and we also included corn and soybean fields. So from 1999 to 2012, there have been a few changes in the acreage where milkweeds could be, but in terms of where milkweeds actually are, there's been some big changes. So the red there is for 2012 and the black is for 1999. The big difference here is the agricultural fields. So whereas before they were very common there, they've basically disappeared as of now. And another thing that we looked at was just the total monarch production that could come out of these different habitats. And again, the thing that you see is that the amount of production coming out of agricultural fields is now very, very low. The other thing you'll notice is how much production was coming out of agricultural fields, say in 1999. So here's what we have from 1999 to 2012. Milkweeds in agricultural fields reduced by almost 99%. If we look at the whole Iowa landscape, maybe 53% of all milkweeds have disappeared. And if we include what we know about the value of milkweeds in agricultural fields, we know that they're about 3.89 times more valuable than ones elsewhere. So if we put that into the calculation, the potential loss of monarch production because of all those milkweeds lost in the field is about 81%. So that's a lot. Now that's potential. And so the next thing I wanted to do was try to figure out, well, we've seen something very significant here. Is this really the smoking gun, if you will? If this is this the thing that's actually causing this decline in monarch population? So, so I wanted to relate monarch production from the Midwest each year to the size of the overwintering population. And I didn't have data for the whole Midwest, but we had data from my friend Bob Hartzler on milkweed densities and habitats in Iowa. So I've been using Iowa as a proxy for the Midwest as a whole. And what I wanted to do then is for any particular year from 1999 to whenever, say how much monarch production is coming out of Iowa. And so to know that, we need to know how many milkweeds are out there, and we need to know how many monarch eggs there are per milkweed in that particular year. And if we multiply those two things together for each habitat, that should tell us what the monarch production is for any particular year. So that's what I wanted to calculate. So to do that, I need to know this. I need to know the number of monarch eggs per plant for any particular year. So I called up, well, let's see, let's back up a little bit here. So how can I get information on all that stuff? How can I get some information on the number of milkweeds? Well, we can use USDA database to tell us, how much land is in CRP, how much land is in pasture, and those kinds of things. We know the area occupied by each habitat. And then Bob Hartzler's censuses can tell us what the milkweed density is in each of those habitats. Milkweed density is relatively unchanged in non-ag habitats, but in ag habitats, we assumed a decline in milkweed density sort of corresponding to this line here. And then the other thing we needed to know was the number of monarchs per stem in each year. And this is where I called up my friend Karen Oberhauser at University of Minnesota. Karen runs the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, and this is a project which I hope some of you may subscribe to. It's not that hard. There are people in all these little areas here with the little red crosses, I guess they are. And what these people do, every year they go out every week to a patch of milkweeds, same patch week after week, count up how many eggs they find, how many larvae they find of different sizes, and so on. And they then feed that information back to Karen. And they've been doing this back in the 1990s to today. And so that data can tell us over the entire breeding range here what they're seeing in terms of the average number of eggs per plant. So we can get, for any particular year from this data set, what the eggs per plant are. So putting all that together, and this is kind of what it looks like. So here are all the different years. This is the average eggs per plant. If you look at that, you don't really see any kind of pattern. And although Chip Taylor will tell you how you can sort of figure out what these numbers should be. But that's the data set on eggs per plant, and then we have data on number of milkweeds. And so keeping in mind that there's more eggs on ag milkweeds than non-ag milkweeds. So if we put that all together, so here's the combination of those basically two data sets, number of milkweeds and eggs per milkweed. And so what you see then is something that corresponds, not surprisingly, to what we saw in terms of number of milkweeds. Number of milkweeds are going down, and monarch production is going down too. Then the trick was to see, well, if we look at the size of the overwintering population in a particular year, let's say 2004, does production in that year correspond to the size of the population? So that's what this next graph looks like. So here's monarch production in the Midwest as we've estimated it, and here's the size of the overwintering population in the years that you see here. And what you see is there's a very good correlation between these two. And it's not simply that everything's kind of going down in lockstep. There are years that are not so good, and then there are years that are better. It's kind of all jumbled up. But the point is that what we measure in the Midwest, or really Iowa, in terms of estimating monarch production, corresponds very closely to the size of the population that you see in Mexico. So that tells us that what we're looking at here is something that's important. It's something that's driving the size of the population. And since what we're seeing here in the Midwest is a reduction in the number of milkweeds, that means that the reduction in milkweeds is really driving the reduction in the size of the population. What's the magnitude of that decline? Well, as I said before, we estimate maybe an 81% decline in Midwest monarch production, and there's been a 72% decline over that period in the size of the overwintering population. So those two numbers are sort of in the same ballpark too, which also tells us we're looking at something that's sort of cause and effect. One of the things that I've tried to get a handle on is just what is the magnitude of this thing? How many milkweeds have been lost in this whole process? And there are two potential losses. One is actually in the agricultural fields because of use of Roundup herbicide. But then a second one that we need to factor in is the fact that we have a lot of grassland, non-ag land that's being converted to ag land. So CRP land that's taken away from CRP and put back into production. And this has increased lately because of things like the ethanol mandate and so on. We can talk more about that. So here's just a graph showing you these red lines here demarcate the size of the summer breeding range for monarchs. And you can see all these colored areas tell you something about the loss of grasslands or habitats that milkweeds would be in that have now been converted to crop fields where if there are any left, the Roundup's going to get them. So here's some estimates. So how many milkweeds have we lost since 1999? So we've lost them from agricultural fields, and then we've lost them as grasslands have been converted. If you go through those calculations, we'll get down here to the final number here. So about a billion milkweed plants, milkweed stems, if you will, have been lost over this period of time. That's a large number. You can also look at these calculations, run through these calculations, try to figure out, well, what have we got left? And what I come up with is about 711 million. So you can see that the number lost is greater than the number that remains. And one of the questions you can ask then is, well, how many monarchs can the present number of milkweed support? So we've basically taken the carrying capacity of for the monarch population, way down. Where are we at this point? So we can actually use this regression relationship that I found to figure that out. So we can figure out, okay, we know there's 711 million milkweed plants currently on the landscape. How much monarch production would that be in sort of, say, an average year for monarchs, average weather-wise and so on? And then knowing what that is, then we can back calculate. We can say, okay, that would be the equivalent of this many hectares of overwintering population. So I won't go through all the calculations here, but the average number of eggs per stem is 0.204. If we crank through all this, come down here to the bottom, basically there's about 3.9 hectares of capacity out there presently on the landscape. Now, let's go back to our graph here showing us what the size of the overwintering population is. So 4 hectares, here's 4 hectares is about here. Well, we saw 4 hectares back in 2010, 2011, but it's been much, much lower since then. And which sort of begs the question, well, why don't we have 4 hectares now if there's 4 hectares worth of milkweeds out there? Well, the thing to keep in mind here is that this carrying capacity, if you will, is just that it's a potential. It's a potential if all the other factors going into monarch populations are good. And so what we've seen actually, particularly in the last 2 years, and to some extent here as well, things have not been good weather-wise for monarchs. So let's see if you can remember back. It always gets harder and harder to remember what an average year is like and what the weather was like in 2000 whatever. 2012, how would you characterize the summer of 2012? Dry and very hot, right? And in fact, it was very hot very early on in the spring. And when the monarchs came out of Texas to move up north, they should move up fairly slowly. They should move up in conjunction with milkweed starting to pop up out of the ground. In 2012, it was so warm they just went whoosh, and they went way up north. People in Newfoundland were ecstatic. They were seeing monarchs. They'd never seen monarchs before. Well, they hadn't seen monarchs before. There's no milkweed up there, or not in more northern areas. So the monarchs just went way out of their way, and that wasn't very good for the population. 2013 was on the cool side for monarchs, and that, when it's cool in the summer breeding range, that's not good for monarchs either. So what we have then is we have an environment that has a certain capacity for raising, if you will, a certain number of monarchs, but whether that capacity can be achieved is going to really depend on a lot of these other weather factors that influence monarch populations. One question that Laura and I and some other people wrestled with in a meeting we had a couple weeks ago was this. Well, what's the size of the overwintering population that we need for the population to be resilient to weather events like in 2012 and 2013? In other words, how big should the population be so that things like that won't drive them to extinction? Well, it's hard to say. If the carrying capacity is really about 4 hectares, we can see 2012, 2013, what weather can do to knock it down below that. And we can say, well, the population was way too low last year. I mean, 40 million butterflies, like I say, seems like a lot, but I'll show you something that'll be pretty outstanding, astounding in a minute here. So just as a sort of mental exercise, what if we said, well, I'm not happy with 4 hectares. I want to raise it to 4.5 hectares. Doesn't seem like a lot. What would it take to raise the carrying capacity? Well, it's going to take more milkweeds. And how many milkweeds would it take to get there? Again, I won't go through all the calculations with you, but you can show that it's going to need about a 22% increase in the number of milkweeds on the landscape to raise the carrying capacity just about 0.5 hectares.
Those are not agricultural milkweeds, those are just outside.
That's just all milkweeds everywhere. Basically, agricultural milkweeds don't exist anymore, so they're not in the picture. I mean, we could try to put them back in the fields, but we won't go there just yet. But so 23 million, we need 23 million more milkweeds just in Iowa to achieve that. 23 million more milkweeds. And if we take the whole Midwest area, we need 156 million milkweed stems to achieve that. That would raise the carrying capacity about 0.6 hectares or about 40 million monarchs. If we wanted to raise it higher than that, we can crank through the calculations and see what's possible. So what is needed? What can be done? Well, first of all, we have to stop the bleeding. So we're as I said, we're losing grassland to ag land in part because of the ethanol mandate, which has made corn prices pretty high, although they're coming back down now. But the problem is that the incentives for farmers to keep non-ag land in non-ag, those incentives just aren't really there anymore. And because of the high prices of corn, it's better to take even marginal land and convert it to ag land. So we've got to stop the bleeding, but then we're going to have to increase the number of milkweeds on the landscape. And so what we need to do then is identify places where that can be done. So federal lands, the feds are pretty much on board with doing this. CRP land is a good bet. Roadsides, don't have to talk about roadsides here at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Home gardens, people growing things in their gardens. So let's just take a look at some of these potential areas and what we could get from them. So CRP land is really a prime candidate for milkweed augmentation. So there are 5 million acres of CRP land in the Midwest. This is land, it's set aside. The primary goal of CRP land is to take what would have been marginal farmland, which would be eroding away, plant it to something to stabilize the soil. And to get into the CRP program, the simplest thing is you just plant grasses in your CRP land. The soil is stabilized, that's all great, but 5 million acres, you could put all sorts of things. You could put milkweeds on there, which I'm talking about, but you could put other flowering plants on there too, where we're also in a general pollinator decline, so it could contribute to that as well. 43% of the milkweeds currently in the Midwest are actually already in CRP lands. I mean, milkweeds that have gotten there just because that's what milkweeds do. But as I said, we've got this concern about acres being taken out of CRP. So to do this, to get milkweeds on CRP land, a lot of things have to happen. Economic incentives have to be changed to encourage farmers to do that. And somehow to get farmers on board with this is going to require some work. Roadsides, also a lot of potential, 10 million acres of road in the Midwestern roadsides. And again, a lot of the milkweeds that we have already are in roadsides, but we could augment that. Again, various kinds of practices can be important here, like people like to mow roadsides. They like to spray things on roadsides. We have programs such as the one here to plant native vegetation. So roadsides are another main area where we can focus on. So what are the prospects for the future here? Well, there has been a petition to the federal government to make monarch butterflies an endangered species. So to list the monarch butterfly, meaning they've marshaled a bunch of evidence to indicate that this is a species that is threatened anyway, not endangered yet, but threatened. And certainly the low population that we saw overwintering in 2013 is a little scary. I don't know that the monarch is likely to go extinct, but the low population size does make them vulnerable to all those other little sticky points in their life cycle. So, you know, persistent drought in Texas and other kinds of things. But let me show you one thing, because they put all their eggs in one basket. Okay, this is 2002. In January of 2002, on the overwintering grounds, a big storm came in. First there was rain, and so all the butterflies got drenched, and then it got very cold, below freezing temperatures. There were about 1 billion overwintering monarchs at this point. Half of them, well, 75, there was more than 1 billion. 75% of the population died in this winter storm. So here's a guy, he's standing there. He's not kneeling, he's standing there. So there were dead monarchs up to here. And here he's reaching his hand out. So just a huge number. Now, what if a storm like this had happened in 2013 when there are only like 40 million monarchs? We don't know, but that's where the vulnerability comes in. So the bigger the population, the more resilient it's likely to be, the more likely they are to withstand various kinds of disasters like this. So in terms of conservation efforts, there's the forests in Mexico. There has been some illegal logging there. The government of Mexico is kind of on board with preserving monarchs now, and the governments of Mexico and the United States and Canada have actually signed agreements to try to preserve monarch butterflies. But the main thing that we can do here is increase milkweed availability. So we can do that in CRP lands, roadsides, backyards, whatever, and manage those areas in ways that don't disrupt the life cycle. So to save the monarch migration, plant milkweed. Thank you. Mitch.
Is there a particular variety that's better than others? I saw mostly common milkweed.
Well, okay, so that's a good question. There are different varieties of milkweeds. There's butterfly weed with the little orange flowers, and there's common milkweed, which you're familiar with, and there's world milkweed. I mean, there's a whole bunch of species just in the Midwest alone, swamp milkweed and so on. You know, we don't know exactly the value of those different things to monarchs, and we have a graduate student in our department that I'm working with and some other people are working with, and we're going to try to figure out what the value is. So there's some anecdotal stuff, for example. You know, in restorations and planting milkweeds, what's the milkweed that people always would like to have in their restorations? Butterfly weed. It nice orange flowers, it blooms for a long time. Well, there's some anecdotal information that monarchs really don't do well on butterfly weed. The females don't oviposit there, or maybe the larvae don't do very well growing on it. So that's something to investigate, because one of the things we want to do, if we're going to put more milkweed on the landscape, we have to put milkweed out there that monarchs are going to use. Otherwise, we can feel good about ourselves and count the number of milkweeds we put out there, but if monarchs aren't using them, that's not very useful. Common milkweed, most of the monarchs that you would find in Mexico, you can look at their cardinalide profile. They've come from common milkweed. But that's only because common milkweed is so common. So the one advantage to using common milkweed, if you're going to sort of try to augment the number of milkweeds out there, is it reproduces vegetatively. So you get a couple plants out there, the next thing you know, you got 10, you got 20. Well, that's also the downside, because people doing this in their gardens, next thing you know, they're in your garden and in your lawn, and they're all over the place. Plus, if we're going to talk to farmers about planting milkweed, well, they've spent decades probably of their lives trying to get rid of that thing from their fields. And so just turning the mental knobs to find this acceptable, it could be very difficult. But so we need to kind of evaluate these different milkweed species and see which ones are really the best for the monarchs, from the monarch's perspective, and also in terms of if we want to augment the number of milkweeds, in terms of just establishment, the whole restoration thing. Which ones are easy to get out there? If you're doing this from seed, you probably know different seed costs different amounts. Common milkweed seed, you can get tons of that. You can collect it yourself. These other things get more expensive.
So is there a move to try to increase the CRP land?
Well, again, the incentives have to be there. So there are some things that I should mention, and CRP, there's a whole host of different things that happen on CRP land. So the most common one is planting grasses and so on, but there's different kinds of CRP land. And in 2011, a new type of CRP land came into existence called CP42. And this is pollinator habitat CRP land, where farmers are paid extra to not just plant some grasses and things, but actually some flowering things will flower throughout the entire season and support pollinators. So far I haven't seen milkweeds in that mix, but there's no reason you couldn't have it in there. So there's some incentives now to take the CRP land that's there and convert it to things that are going to be pollinator friendly and hopefully monarch friendly as well. June of this year, the president signed a memorandum about pollinator health. So all the branches of the federal government are now kind of on board to try to see what they can do to increase the number of pollinators and take lands within their dominion and increase flowering plants, and certainly milkweeds could be part of that. In terms of just increasing the amount of CRP land as a whole, again, those incentives, those financial incentives have to be there to prevent you from plowing under your CRP land and turning it back into corn or soybeans.
One of your earlier graphic slides showed a map that you said indicated that half of the monarchs in the Midwest were coming from the overwintering areas known in Mexico.
Right.
Black with the gray.
Right.
Where's the other half coming from?
So that gray area there, that darker gray area, was surrounded by sort of a much larger, lighter gray area.
97%.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that gray area was like 50-ish%, and so the other 50% would be all those lighter gray areas all around there.
Okay.
And it's probably more than 50%. Yeah.
As well as places for eggs,
Mm-hmm.
you do need to consider places for the adults to nectar, because if
Right.
they haven't a good nutrition, they're not going to make it.
Right. So yeah, and that's important, and that's where there's kind of a win-win thing here going on. So there is a lot of interest now in improving things for pollinators, having enough flowering plants out there for pollinators. And if you do that, you're going to be helping monarchs too, because the females have to nectar to stay alive to lay eggs, but also they have to nectar to be able to get to Mexico. And so the other thing with the migration to Mexico that's very important is to have nectar sources along the way. So there are things called way stations, people planting things in their gardens or near schools or wherever that have nectar, particularly in the fall, because that's when they're going to be moving down to Mexico and they need nectar to get those lipid reserves up. Greg?
You said that there was higher egg density, I think, on milkweed and ag fields than in roadsides or other places. Can you speculate as to why they're preferring to use milkweeds in ag fields over other?
Yeah, there are a number of possibilities, and some of these I've kind of looked into. So one is, maybe the quality of the milkweeds there in agricultural fields is better than out there on a roadside. For one thing, the ones in the field have been fertilized along with the corn or soybeans. And so I have looked at actually the nitrogen content of the leaves in milkweeds here versus over here, and the nitrogen content is higher. Nitrogen is typically an important thing for developing larvae. So that's a possibility. The other possibility is that monarch females, when they're looking for milkweed, they're using odor cues, and then when they get close, they look for them visually. And so if you see them coming into your yard, it's because and you've got milkweed there, they picked up an odor cue. But once they get there, you'll see them, you'll say, well, you came here because they're milkweeds, why can't you just go right? They'll look at a whole bunch of different things until they finally find the milkweed plant, or how many there are. Think about a soybean field, or think about a corn field. There's the milkweed signal, the odor signal, against basically a uniform background of corn or soybeans. So I think part of the other thing is just easier for them to find the milkweeds there, because it's just like this little beacon in the middle of a field. Here's the milkweed. And you get there, and there's not all these other plants that you have to search out. That's the milkweed. It's right there. So I think that's part of it too. A third thing is also having to do with the quality of the leaves. So typically milkweed leaves in a shaded environment, it's a thinner leaf. If you look at milkweed leaves in the summertime, it gets kind of thick, and it's kind of the little larvae, when it first hatches, has to somehow chew through that stuff. But a nice thin leaf is a lot easier for them to chew into. And so underneath the canopy of corn or even soybeans, you get those nice thin leaves too. And in fact, I think, still another thing is, one of the things that conventional herbicides were doing in these fields was basically defoliating the plants and then fresh stuff. And this is also, it's kind of an interesting phenomenon with roadside. So you say, well, okay, they've gone in, they've mowed down all the milkweed in this roadside. Oh, that's terrible. Well, but then all this new growth comes out, and that new growth, the leaves are not tough, they're high quality leaves. And so it could be that, some of these, the conventional use of herbicides was actually producing a nice flush of new leaves that was promoting the use by monarchs. Yeah?
Does it matter if I've got milkweeds and they don't bloom? I've had that phenomenon for about 2 years.
There's common milkweed?
Yeah.
Right. Are they in a shady area or not?
Well,
Not particularly.
yeah, kind of, I suppose. Is that,
They'd be less likely to bloom in a shady area, but out in the sun they should bloom. Yeah.
What about the neonicotinoid types of
Well, that's a good question. So a lot of the monarch people are thinking about this sort of stuff. So the neonicotinoids, if you don't know, this is an insecticide. It's commonly used as a seed coating for corn and soybeans. There's also a foliar application, but that's not really done too much here in the Midwest. So basically, virtually all corn seeds, for example, are coated with these things. And the idea is that the seed then is protected from insects that might be gnawing on it. And you plant them in the ground, and that insecticide is there for corn rootworms and stuff. But what happens is that these things, in the planting process, they kind of get off as dust. So basically there's neonic dust all over the place. And we know that this is bad for honeybees. So honeybee pollen, almost all honeybee pollen has this stuff in there. So when their honeybees are feeding their babies pollen, they're also feeding them this insecticide. We don't really know whether these are bad for monarchs or not. Monarchs would have to get these. The adults might get it if the neonics get into nectar and they're feeding on nectar. Sometimes the neonics get picked up by the plants themselves. So that's an active area of investigation. Was there another question back there?
Yeah, I was interested in your thoughts on kind of detectability of milkweed in ag fields and whether or not there's been any work in like native grass communities looking at various levels of diversity. You can imagine you could kind of reproduce that in a setting where you had a low diversity grass mix, or in somebody's yard where you don't have a lot of competing native plants. Maybe you could get those benefits of those milkweeds being somewhat isolated in other settings besides agricultural fields.
So there's a lot of CRP land, like I said, that's just in grasses of one sort. So what would happen if you just went in there, rather than trying to do complete prairie restoration, just add milkweed seeds, and then would you be getting into a situation like we sort of had for cornfields where they're easy to find and so on? I think that's a good idea. I think that would work. Laura.
Back to the sort of the thing, the issue of nectaring plants. One of our problems is that we can easily detect activity on milkweed plants with eggs and with larvae that are chewing, but we can't detect or measure, that's subsidized by these plants that are providing the energy for the female to get there and lay the eggs. So there's all of this conversation that you and I have been a part of about milkweeds and focusing on that, but partly because it's so difficult to detect or to test, well, how much of the nectaring population do we need and how close by? It simply isn't as easy to tell that a monarch's been there. We need to be able to tell, okay, these monarchs have been using these nectar plants in the system, and since we can't tell, then all the focus ends up being on the milkweed.
Right. So, yeah, and so you have to ask yourself these questions because if you're going to initiate an effort to try to rectify the thing, you're saying to yourself, okay, well, I can get tons of common milkweed seed. I'm just going to be Johnny Milkweed seed and just go throw that everywhere. To what extent will that make the situation better? But I know they need these nectar plants too. How much effort should I put into doing that? That's going to be a little harder to do probably. And I don't want to discount the importance of the nectar plants, but if you think back to 1999, 2000, and so on, the amount of nectar plants there was, I don't know how different it was than today, but the big difference between then and now is the loss of milkweed plants. So I think, the major effort has to really go into putting more milkweed plants out there. But I think because we have a lot of impetus for pollinator health and so on. We just combine those two things and say, we're going to put things out there that are going to be good for milkweed, for monarchs, and things that are going to be good for pollinators in general. And then it's a win-win for both.
Can I
Last-
take one more question?
Last question.
Thank you.
Make it a good one.
Now, I've been thinking a lot about this issue as a parallel to the passenger pigeon, which was in the billions, and then at one point, there was a population that wasn't able to recover, and it plummeted. And when are we going to be at that plummet?
Yeah. Well, that's yeah, a very good question. I mean, this is what, you know, when I pose this question, you know, how many hectares do we need to have a resilient population? I mean, we see that with the passenger pigeon. We've seen that with fisheries, where, you know, the fish have been fished down to a certain level, and then fishing has been stopped for decades, and they just haven't recovered. And so there's this known phenomenon in population biology. There's some threshold below which, you know, you just can't get it back to going again. We don't really know what that is for the monarch. I mean, it has a capacity. A female can lay 500 to 1,000 eggs. I mean, there's capacity in the system, particularly for things like insects. You know, we've got a generation in Texas, and we got 2 to 3 generations beyond that. I mean, the capacity could be there to really ramp this thing up. I mean, we know that insect population is going to explode and then go back. So we don't really know, but that's something we're trying to kind of figure out with doing some modeling sorts of things.
We were at the preserve area in the spring of 2010.
Oh, okay.
That low level, and they
That
were
was-
very distressed about them being that low, and then the next year it went up a bit, and then it's been really plummeting
Right.
since.
Right.
That's been really
Yeah, I mean, so the level, you know, the 40 million that we had in 2013, I think everybody would agree that that's probably just a very vulnerable level to be at. I think the indications are now that this coming year it will be above that, but how much above we don't really know. So whether hopefully we haven't reached gone to that threshold of no return.
Well, thank you, John. Obviously, the members of the talk.